We are wrapping up a series today called Better. Better, handful of words, each word one a week that we've been reflecting on, talking about, seeing where it might take us. And we began, if you can think back this far, we began when the new year seemed so fresh and new, and now it's just old hat to write 2019 on your checks, if you even do something that old-fashioned. Or your notes, or your school papers, or your letters from the office, whatever it may be. We're down pat. We've got it. No matter what, every new year brings that sense of, I wonder what the new year will bring us. And by this time in the new year, we pretty much know what it's going to bring us because that's what we've planned for it to bring. We have a pretty good idea because we found our rhythm and we know what to expect, and that's exactly how we like it. Don't you like it that way? Pretty predictable? Yeah. Well, we went to Stephen and Emily's yesterday to celebrate our grandson Callan's 3rd birthday. We've thrown enough children's birthday parties that I pretty much knew what to expect. Loud kids, hovering parents, cake, and messy fingers. And we got all of that. And we got more than that. Callan is all boy. And he decided that he wanted a crocodile-themed birthday party. So they found an organization that brings creepy crawly things right to your house and lets the kids hold them and pet them and all kinds of stuff. So you can see there's an iguana. Wait, back up just one more time to that other one. And then to the right, he is holding a little alligator. And let me tell you, it had some teeth that would have gnawed his little finger off. So she was helping him make sure that you hold it in the right place. And then she had some other lizards that she took out. Go ahead to the next picture. Placed one on his head because that's just what boys do. And his little 2-year-old cousin is behind him, and he seems to understand. You do realize that's a lizard on your head. He was having none of it. And then everybody was doing pretty good with that. They have turtles and other kind of reptiles. And then when the woman started bringing out the snakes, she starts bringing out the snakes, and all of the kids are down front, and they're having a great time, and all the parents are looking for where the door is. It was totally unexpected and just absolutely delightful. So I was pretty certain about this odd story from Luke's gospel today. I've preached on it a number of times. Even though it's full of mystery, Jesus shining like a glow stick in the dark, and Moses and Elijah looking pretty good for a couple of guys who've been dead for a couple of centuries. They're all chatting together while Peter, James, and John wake from sleep and wonder if they're still dreaming. Matthew and Mark tell this story, so I already knew where it's supposed to go. And you do too when you hear it. You've probably heard it enough in your time. You could probably preach this sermon yourself. Those peak moments of life. Those wonderful moments that give you the high and help you navigate the valley that lays below. Or if you're looking for something a little more theological, it's that idea that the law, Moses, is standing alongside the prophets, Elijah, and they both point to Jesus, who shines the brightest, and therefore we're to listen to him. That's pretty much what we expect today. So I was caught off guard when Luke writes, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. In fact, the first time I read it, I read exactly what I expected to be there. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. But that is not what Luke says. Jesus took with him Peter, John, and James. I know, small detail, right? It's the same 3 guys, Tutterow, so get on with it. But it's the only time in all of Scripture that these same 3 are mentioned in that order. Every other time it's Peter, James, and John. John always follows James, who always follows Peter, even for Luke. Luke always does that. except for here. And if you're thinking right now that this is going to be a really long and boring sermon, if this is the best I've come up with for an opener, hang with me. Because it's not the way I intended to start this sermon, nor does it follow the neat little outline that I came up a couple of days ago and is now in your bulletin notes. I'd like to say I like surprises, but the reality is I pretty much like to know what's going to be happening on a Sunday morning, which is why I plan my sermons weeks in advance. And I just soon not change what I had planned. I mean, I ask God to help me write my sermons, but I really don't expect God to intervene and do so, let alone to do so on a Sunday morning. So since God messed me up and took me somewhere I didn't intend to go and had to rewrite my sermon, I decided, like Peter, John, and James, I would take you up the mountain with Jesus and to see what else might be going on that could be different. And it turns out there's plenty. Only Luke tells us that Jesus took them to pray. The others just say they went up the mountain. But Luke focuses on prayer, and Matthew and Mark leave that little detail out. All three talk about Jesus' clothing glowing with light, but only Luke says that they flashed like lightning. And Matthew and Mark say Jesus' appearance was transfigured. The word is metamorphosis, like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. But that's not the word that Luke uses. He just says that his appearance was altered. It changed somehow. And all three mention Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus, but only Luke tells us the content of their conversation. He says that they had a kind of glory around themselves and that they were talking about Jesus' departure. And the word that he uses there is the unique word, his exodus. Well, what's going on with that? And then only Luke adds the detail that the disciples were heavy-lidded. Literally, meaning they were falling asleep until the light roused them and they started paying attention to what was happening. We do that all the time in the middle of the night when a lightning storm takes place and the flashes of light pierce our closed eyelids and wake us up. Matthew says Peter came up with the great idea of building something for Moses and Elijah and Jesus to stay in. Mark says he did it because he was scared and he just needed to say something. And Luke says Peter did it because he was just blabbering like he was still talking in his sleep. All three of them speak about a cloud and the voices we've all heard once before at the river where Jesus is baptized. This is my son. But Matthew and Mark add the statement, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. But that's not what Luke says, even though he said it at the riverside earlier in the book. He says, this is my chosen. Why that different word? It's not what I expected. And then the trio of disciples look around, and Moses and Elijah are nowhere in sight, and only Jesus is there with them, looking the way he had always looked to them. And they start back down the mountain, and Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus told Peter and James and John not to tell anybody what happened. But Luke doesn't say Jesus told them to keep it to themselves. It's just simply that they did. Though apparently they didn't, or else we wouldn't have this version of the story. So when I got to the end of Luke's story, I realized I was reading something completely different than what I expected. What I thought I already knew. And that's when this morning it just changed my sermon. Do you ever find yourself thrown off by discovering what you thought you knew so well is not what you really think you know? During the past couple of weeks for our Wednesday Bible study, I've asked those who've attended to help me write the sermon. You may be wishing that they had offered me more help. 2 Wednesdays ago, we were talking about forgiveness as we thought about the issue of attitude. And we spent some time thinking about what does resentment look like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? And we were popcorning out some ideas. And then we started talking about forgiveness, and I asked the question, what do you think forgiveness sounds like? What do you think it would feel like? What would forgiveness smell like? gave them a quote from Mark Twain. Forgiveness is the fragrance the violet leaves on the heel that has crushed it. Think about that. The fragrance the violet leaves on the heel that has crushed it. And then I said, what do you think forgiveness looks like? Now that night, the residents of Hickory Log Men's Home for Developmentally Disabled Adults was with us. They had spent the day at the church because a thunderstorm had knocked out their power the night before. Because it was rather cold that week, their place had gotten quite chilly, and they needed a warm place for the men to be able to stay. So they came over here and spent the day with us. And then we invited them to go ahead and just stay for church supper. And so they came into Fellowship Hall and shared dinner with us. We learned that Georgia Power had worked overtime and finally got their power restored. But the place was still pretty cold, so they lingered. And since they were used to doing Bible study at their place on Wednesdays, a dozen of the men shared in Bible study with us that night. And it made for a very interesting time. When I asked the group what forgiveness would look like, we all threw out a few ideas, and then one of the men from Hickory Log spoke up and said, it would be like somebody who had something really heavy on their shoulders and then someone taking it off, and they would look lighter. And like the other Heritage members, I found myself amazed at his response. It was beautiful, it was wise, it was spot on. It was glorious. It was not what I expected. It was not what I thought I already knew about that man, nor what I thought I knew about all of the guests. None of us talked about it that night. But we did this past week. Because we all remembered that moment. We all talked about a word that we thought we knew so well until this man spoke up and brought us up to a very high place and showed us something new. And it was as if God's glory had broken out and shone through him, and we were all captured by it, awed by it, as if God's own voice was saying, listen to him. I suspect it happens to us more than we realize. We go through our days with pretty good idea of what to expect. And rarely does something happen that causes us to rethink what we know, to see something from a new perspective. Like the parent who once told me about all of his thoughts about those who cross the border illegally, until he said his daughter had married an illegal alien. And now he couldn't think about the issue. He's a member of this church, by the way, Bill Seymour. You see, once we see something from a new perspective, we can't see anything else the same way again, even things we thought we knew so well. My guess is Peter and John and James never looked at Jesus quite the same way after that day on the mountain, nor at themselves. They became aware that the glory was all around them, even within them, and just waiting to burst out with light. We stand here on this 32nd anniversary of our church, and we have lots of mountaintop stories, stories of light and of glory that we could spend lots of time telling today. And tonight we'll hear some challenges for the road ahead, some ideas about some new mountains that we can ascend and experience God's power and presence in new ways, even for our future. We're plotting the spots out where we think the glory already rests. But just because we have a pretty good idea of who we are and where we're going, we would be wrong to really think that we know where we're going to be a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. Because like this message did with me, God will find a way to break out among us and through us and in us, and sometimes in ways like Peter that leave us fumbling for words to try to describe it or capture it, or like James and John just absolutely speechless about it. But that's what happens when you follow the unpredictable Jesus. who has the most unexpected way of turning on the light for us and showing us something new about God and about ourselves and about the world that he loves. And it's always more than we thought, greater than we dared to imagine. And he keeps taking us up and then bringing us down from the mountaintops in order to take us to new places that we never dreamed of before. It can be unsettling, these clouds of unknowing. As good as our plans may be, though, if we keep listening to Jesus, he's going to take us places beyond our best laid plans. And we should hope he does. And when we least expect it, from the people we least expect, light will burst forth, and it will change us and transfigure us, and we'll recognize it as the very light of Christ himself, bursting in upon us and drawing us to it. And it will change us. It'll transfigure us. And that will be glorious. May it be so, Lord Jesus. May it be so.